Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the Dean for the invitation and Simon for the hospitality and getting me all set up. I'm virtually computer illiterate, so should probably plunge in. When I timed this yesterday, it timed out at 42 minutes, but that read-through didn't involve the computer and everything. So the broad topic is violence and the Bible, and I entitled tonight's lecture, Violence and Human Society in the Bible. To take up the question of violence and the Bible in 3 short lectures seems almost a proposition of folly. So tangled are the threads dangling from the question that any sort of final resolution is an impossibility. What I propose to do is open up for our consideration some of the underlying issues, and through looking at some specific texts and moments over the next 3 evenings, explore how the Bible might be of help in understanding the larger issue of violence in human society, violence in religion, and God and violence. In this lecture, I want to take a look at a couple of texts from Genesis. In the second lecture, I will look at one of the oldest texts in the Hebrew Bible, holding the picture it suggests of Israelite beginnings in tandem with a later moment that many might argue is the critical and pivotal moment for the formation of both Israel's religious tradition and the Bible we know. In the final lecture, I hope to explore the nexus of violence and religion and some ways in which the canonical text itself critiques and deconstructs this relationship. First, though, let me allude briefly to 3 books which you may find helpful. The first, published in 1999, before the Great Disruption of September 2001, points to the way that even before it became pressing for us to consider the relationship between violence, religions, and various collections of sacred scriptures, biblical scholars were becoming engaged with the problems posed by biblical violence. Mark McIntyre's The Blood of Abel, the Violent Plot in the Hebrew Bible, is a fairly technical work of biblical scholarship that looks at key moments in the narrative of the Hebrew Bible, charting a plot line of violence given and received. In its final chapters, it explores the way that the prophetic voices open up a different trajectory of peace. But McIntyre also observes the way that the imagined future of peace still often rests on an assumption of the necessity of violence to get us there. It's a worthwhile biblical study if you're looking for a solid challenge that will build your technical understanding of the Bible and the shape of its narratives. The second book, published a decade later under the shadow of all that has unfolded since 2001, is Philip Jenkins' Laying Down the Sword: Why We Can't Ignore the Bible's Violent Verses, published in 2011. Jenkins is a distinguished scholar of religion, and his book is very much directed into the religio-political discourse of an American audience. It includes a fairly helpful study of the Koran and its texts about violence, set in relation to what Jenkins argues are a considerably more violent set of texts inherited by Christians in our Bible. Jenkins poses the question to the contemporary church about its irresponsibility in shaping its lectionaries by systematically choosing to ignore violent texts so that they are never discussed or preached in public. He offers some useful guidelines for those called to preach as to how they should approach their task. In many ways, I am taking my cue for these lectures from his challenge to us to begin speaking in public about the violent passages. Quite correctly, I think, Jenkins sees the problem as one that resides not in the Bible itself, but in us as its interpreters. The most recent of these books, published a month ago, is Karen Armstrong's Fields of Blood: Religion and the History of Violence. And I overheard someone say that they were in the process of reading it. Armstrong is responding to what has become a commonplace in much current public discourse, the argument that religion is the root cause of all violence and war. It's a thick book and a doughty pushback proceeding through a fairly detailed examination of the history of world violence in the ancient Near East, Europe, Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. Armstrong's argument is that violence is first a manifestation of structural inequities in societies, social and economic, and the force required to maintain those inequitable structures, or that conversely arise in resistance to them. It is in partnership with the forces of oppression that religion emerges as a mechanism for maintaining the status quo and becomes an apologist for violence. Building on her prior work on Islam, she offers a helpful picture both of the emergence of Islam in the 6th to 8th centuries, but also of the way that the contemporary manifestations of extremism in some quarters of Islam rise from the inherited and accumulated structural problems of 20th century European and North American colonialisms. This forms the concluding chapters of a thoroughgoing dismantling of the illusions that modernity and Enlightenment rationalism have reduced human violence in the past 350 years. Armstrong entitles her first chapter, Farmers and Herdsmen, and this offers a good jumping off point to plunge us into the biblical text. I want to look first this evening at Genesis 4, which you have on one side of the sheet. Genesis 4 begins with the story of Cain and Abel and proceeds after Cain's disappearance into the east with a history of the emergence of human civilization and culture and the exponential increase of human violence. At some level, this is very clearly intended by those who shaped our biblical canon as we have received it to be a foundational account of the origins of human violence. And in the basic structure of the narrative, as I just gave it, a presentation of the way that violence seems inseparable from all human civilization. I want to suggest that this short, lapidary text encodes an invitation to consider the complexities of the origins of human violence. Armstrong, MacIntyre, and many, in fact most other commentators, draw attention to the fact that the text differentiates between Cain and Abel on the basis of their way of making a living. The one as an agriculturalist and the other as a herdsman. And the way that this distinction marked a major point of cleavage between economic systems and forms of social life in the ancient world. So the text is clearly pointing us to socioeconomic tensions as a foundational source of violence. But there's more going on. Cain and Abel are brothers. So the first murder is also rooted in sibling rivalry. How we find ourselves placed in our families of origin. Cain is the firstborn, worthy in his mother's eyes of a naming etiology. Then the text tells us, next she bore his brother Abel. So it's not just sibling rivalry, but parental favoritism. Lest we lose sight of it, though, that Cain and Abel are brothers reminds us of the most fundamental truth about violence. It is always our brother or sister whom we are seeking to kill. There are, in reality, no outsiders in the human family. The names of the brothers point us somewhere else. Cain's name is linked in the biblical etymology to a verb meaning to get, or to acquire, or even in some cases, to subjugate. The name points us to the social reality of the patriarchal order in which the firstborn takes all. but it also, as do all biblical names, intimates a deeper revelation of character. Abel, or Hevel, is a word that links to the common noun for breath or vapor. By the period at which the scriptural canon is taking final shape, Hevel also has come to mean emptiness or vanity, most famously in the refrain that runs throughout the late wisdom book Ecclesiastes, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." Human violence, suggests the text, lies in some sort of fundamental difference between personalities or characters, between those who are go-getters and those who are weak, perhaps unambitious, or able to be taken advantage of. It's not accidental that Psalm 37 and the Beatitudes remind us that the meek will inherit the earth. Then we come to the most ambiguous element of this short narrative. Cain brings a grain offering from his first fruits, and Abel the herdsman brings the fat parts of his best animals. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. No reasons given. That's all in the mind of interpreters. So we might read the text as suggesting that human violence rises out of a sort of divine arbitrariness, almost the way playground violence erupts sometimes over the favoritism of teachers. Conversely, when we recall the divine preference for second sons across the length of the biblical narrative, this story is its first intimation. Whether we see it as the divine whim, divine choice disrupting the social order, or as fate, human violence can and does arrive from our response to the perceived unfairness of it all. Cain, the darling of the family, the oldest son, the hard-working achiever, finds himself mysteriously on the outside of life, and he becomes angry. God's first question is about Cain's response to the situation. Why has your face fallen? Violence might be seen then as a personal psychological predilection to respond with gloom and depression. But the following assertion seems to move in the direction of the exercise of moral choice. If you do well, will you not be accepted? Does our turn to violence emerge from a moral flaw or lack of will to be good? Or is it something else again, as the Lord's next words suggest? If you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. The language of the Hebrew is the language of an animal crouching and ready to spring. So it suggests that violence rises out of our being taken over by something deep in our animal nature, what sometimes is called the reversion to our mammalian or reptilian brain layers. But this phrase is even more loaded. Genesis 4:7 is a rephrasing of Genesis 3:16, in which the woman is told, "Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall master you." Our instinct to violence is something akin to our sexual instinct, suggests the editors of the text by creating this echo. Something so uncontrollable as to lead to disordered relationships. Male domination of women in the patriarchal world in Genesis 3, and murder of another member of the human family in Genesis 4. They go out to the field. Cain rises up against Abel and kills him. Even here, there is ambiguity. Some ancient versions have Cain invite Abel into the field. The traditional Masoretic text simply says, "And Cain said to Abel his brother, and when they were in the field, da 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 da." The ancient readers, like us, were uncomfortable with ambiguity. But it is not clear whether the violence is deliberated and enhanced by deceit, or whether Cain indeed sought to do well and reconcile, and then suddenly gave way to his anger. The text constantly holds before us as a foundational reality that we cannot understand human violence in a simplistic way. In a sense, it reminds us that every act of violence requires an entire social analysis. And this continues in the aftermath and the unfolding consequences. The blow, once struck, leads immediately to the abandonment of any larger social responsibility. Am I my brother's keeper? We are told that the living blood from Abel's wounded corpse is clamoring and crying out from the soil. In sowing the earth with blood, Cain has rendered it incapable of its natural productivity. And as the text proceeds, Cain is progressively alienated from the soil, from other human beings, and from God. Violence does not beget relief, but paranoia. Knowing all people are now enemies, he flees to the east, where he builds the first city to fortify against others and protect himself. So the text wants us to understand that in some sense, all of our cities, all of our culture, music, and implements of cultivation and war, and our social attempts to measure and requite the impact and costs of violence, whether by raw vengeance or the rule of law, all of these are built on a foundation of violence. And as in reality, Abel, like all victims, disappears like a breath into the vapors of history. So violence seems to be ingrained in our biblical texts from their quasi-mythical beginnings. I sometimes refer to this as facing the Bible's shadow side, evoking the psychological notion that it is by facing and entering into the shadow side of our psyche that we experience growth, healing from forces that may be crippling us, and access to creativity and insight. I think Jenkins' book is rightly sparked by the emergence of a particular shadow side in the North American psyche and in North American Christianity in the past decade or so, particularly in relation to the Muslim world. But of course, it has always been there. Over the past few years, I've had occasion to read quite a lot of archival material related to Christian missions in northern Manitoba communities, and the shadow side is there too. When we look back over the history of Christianity, of course, the problem has never been what we do with passages that tell us that God is loving and merciful, and that we ought to be loving and merciful. The problem has always been what we do with the parts of the Bible that seem to imply that God may be angry or violent or vengeful or judgmental. As Jesus reminds us, the problem is not how we should love our friends and those who do good to us, but how we should love our enemies and all those others who don't look and behave like us. But this deep problematic led to one of the earliest great divisions in the church between those who wanted to abandon completely the Hebrew Scriptures, whose great spokesman was the gifted 2nd century theologian Marcion, and those who wanted to retain them as part of the essential collection of authoritative books for Christians. At one level, this was part of the great culture wars of the 2nd century of the Christian era. And we can see that Marcion's opponents wanted to retain the Hebrew Scriptures for a variety of reasons, dogmatic, historical, and prophetic. There may also have been some deep insight, because the decision to retain the Hebrew Scriptures left the Christian tradition saddled with a shadow side in the nature of God and the community of God's faithful people that has demanded rich and complex forms of interpretation. Allegory, typology, spiritualizing, there's a long list. But has also acted itself out at regular intervals in bouts of ideological warfare, idol and altar smashing, witch burning, and stripping of the land and assets of colonized peoples. When I teach Introduction to Old Testament, many questions that emerge in the first instance rise out of the Marcionite problematic. The students assume that Christians believe in a loving, kind, merciful God, and therefore the problem lies in the Scriptures. That God they find there must be another foreign God. And this strain is strong in much of the preaching I hear. In fact, it almost always goes a step further, because it treats that foreign God as the God of the Jews. And therefore, because they have a God like that, Jews are worthy of contempt. Despite the events of the past century, anti-Semitism is also alive and well in many Christian pulpits, and it continues to be concealed in diverse forms in some professional biblical scholarship. Our shadow is inevitably with us. Yet it is almost always through entering into and grappling with these texts of darkness and violence that we open the doors to the important questions. And so the preliminary suggestion I want to make is that the purpose of the Scriptures and the whole notion of a canon of received Scriptures is not first and foremost that they provide us with answers, but that they provide us with a multi-layered, historically rooted, and complex framework to provoke us into asking questions. How the realities of the material and physical world in which we live our lives are shot through with both the grandeur and grace of God, and with spiritual forces and drives that from one instant to another can elevate us to our divine origins or reduce us to utter abjection. I would go so far as to say, contrary to much of the modern received view, that in their collection and redaction over a period of several centuries, the redactors and editors sought to construct such a layered work precisely because it enabled the community of the faithful to find questions and explore answers in a multivocal and nuanced way. In the time remaining, I want to look at a second specific text, Genesis 34. You'll find that on the other side, which certainly figures on many lists as one of the more egregiously violent fragments in the Bible. Its core episode involves the men of Jacob's clan telling the men of Shechem that they will enter into a bond of peace and intermarriage on the condition that the Shechemites circumcise themselves. When the Shechemites do so, Simeon and Levi go into the city and murder all the men while they are still hurting, after which the rest of the Jacobite men plunder the city, seizing all the animals, all the goods, all the children, and all the women. So the text prefigures a much larger body of biblical texts that speak about the practices of herem, often referred to as holy war. This connects in the larger biblical ideological framework to the Deuteronomic preoccupation with destroying the cities and peoples of Canaan. It is about mass murder and the assimilation of one group by another, a form of genocide. It is a narrative about tensions between interacting group identities and establishing and maintaining group boundaries. But while Genesis 34 connects to the other biblical trajectories of violent texts, we should note that contrary to the commonly made assumption, nowhere in the text is there a divine warrant or command to murder the Shechemites. It's completely human initiative. It is part of the cycle of stories about Jacob, taking place after his return from his long sojourn with his uncle in Aram, and follows immediately upon the account of his night wrestling with the ambiguous stranger at the Wadi Yabok in the lead-up to his encounter with Esau, the brother whom he has defrauded. Chapter 33 ends, Jacob came home in peace to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, on his homecoming from the country of Aram, and he encamped facing the city. And he acquired the piece of territory where he had spread out his tent from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 lambs' worth. There he set up a slaughter site and called it El, God, the God of Israel. This closing passage of chapter 33 flags in its first and last phrases the transition in Jacob's life. A transition in identity from his given name, Yaakov, cheat or grasper, to his new name, Yisrael, struggles with God. And it also signals a shift from one who lives in cheating and conflict with others to someone who seeks to live by negotiation and peace. Finally, it signals his turn to a new religiosity. He sets up an altar and names it for his God. So Genesis 34 is a text that emerges out of an apparent desire of a community of faith to live at peace with its neighbors. How then do we understand the vortex of violence that ensues? What questions might the text open up to us that we had not anticipated? The chapter opens, now I'm going to be reading from Everett Fox's translation, so it will probably sound a bit different from what you have. Sorry about that. I originally thought I had it in, I actually had the text already typed out, but I didn't, so I had to take the RSV. So the chapter 34 opens, Now Dinah, Leah's daughter, whom she had borne to Yaakov, went out to see the women of the land, and Shechem, son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her. He took her and lay with her, forcing, or humbling, or humiliating. The word can mean all those things. Forcing her. From the outset, Genesis 34 frames the violence as violence that arises from how men frame and understand the place of women in society. Dinah moves from being an independent agent in her own right, seeking relationships with other women in the first verse, to being sexually assaulted and humbled in the second verse, to being a love object in the third verse, to being a household acquisition in the fourth verse. In the fifth verse, her father's perception is that she has been defiled or made liminal. In the seventh verse, she is the cause of pain and upset to her brothers because someone has lain with her and caused disgrace to Israel, and such a thing is not to be done. In verse 13, the brothers deceive Shechem and his father because Shechem had defiled their sister. In verse 26, Dinah is seized and taken from Shechem's house by her two blood brothers after they have killed its inhabitants. In verse 27, the other half-brothers plunder the city, justifying it because now not just Shechem, but they, now the entire population of the city, had defiled their sister. In the final verse of the chapter, she is alluded to no longer by name, but simply as our sister. And they ask, should she be treated like a whore? So in a variety of ways, the text is about the innate relationship between violence and patriarchy. Along with almost every other biblical text where the place of women in a patriarchal order is at issue, we are asked to see that violence is essential and innate in the maintenance of that order. violence among men, and violence against women and children. Because, as the text makes clear, this violence is as much about punishing and subjugating Dinah, who seeks to be a matriarch and agent in her own right, as it is about punishing Shechem and his associates. The text, however, deliberately complexifies the matter. It would be easy to see the violence as just if egregious punishment for rape. In fact, that's pretty much the standard commentary tradition. The problem is verse 3, where we are told that after lying with her and forcing or humiliating her, Shechem's nephesh, his soul, cleaved to her. The exact same term used to describe the relationship between the human and its partner in Genesis 2:24. We're told that Shechem loved her and that he spoke to her heart. The text never tells us how Dinah feels, but Shechem's emotions of love are alluded to a second time. Within Shechem, there has been a shift from viewing Dinah as an object of desire and possession to being a subject for relationship. And interestingly, the text, in the words of Shechem's father Hamor, links this to the possibility of larger social collaboration between the two groups. The possibility of marriage alliances, settling together, mutual access to land and resources, verses 9 and 10. Part of the problem of the text is that even within the assumptions of a patriarchal order, the egregious violence is exercised against a man and a family seeking to make honorable a situation of wrong. Shechem's sin against the order of patriarchy is not simply that he has used another man's possession, Dinah, always referred to as Jacob's daughter or our sister, but that he then seeks to enter into a relationship with her as subject, cleaving, loving, and seeking to speak to her heart. In fact, in the entire text, it is only the foreigner, Shechem, who seeks to engage Dinah intersubjectively. The text not only occludes her own reactions or emotions, but consistently projects onto her the emotions or perceptions of her own family. Why am I talking about all this? It's because only by entering into the problematic of the excessive violence of this chapter and the way it arises out of the patriarchal order that we begin to perceive the way that the text is laying bare for us critical dynamics of patriarchy. That the violence was a matter of debate in the ancient world just as much as in our own reactions in the 21st century is made clear in Jacob's concluding comment, which is critical of his son's actions because they have brought the family into ill repute among the people of the land and put them at risk because of their relative smallness as a social group. Of the Bible, the critique is repeated much more strongly in Jacob's great poem of prophetic blessing on his offspring in Genesis 49, 5-7. Shimon and Levi, such brothers, weapons of violence are their ties of kinship. To their counsel may my being, this is Jacob's voice, to their counsel may my being never come. In their assembly may my person never unite. For in their anger they kill men. In their self-will they maim bulls. Damned and accursed be their anger, that it is so fierce, their fury, that it is so harsh. I will split them up in Yaakov, I will scatter them in Yisrael. This passage, with its critique of the violence of the brothers Simeon and Levi, leads to yet another set of inner-biblical resonances relating to violence, and I will return to these in the third of these lectures. But Genesis 20 resonates in another way as well with larger themes of the book. The redactors of Genesis have deliberately set Genesis 34 into a structural relationship with another section of Genesis. The larger book falls broadly into two halves. equal halves in terms of chapters, in which larger blocks of material, such as the Abraham and Jacob cycles, as well as discrete chapters, stand in parallel and contrastive relationships with one another. This is often referred to as ring form or chiastic structure. These interrelationships among the parts set them into relationships of analogy that invite us to look more closely at similarities and differences. The anthropologist Mary Douglas has written in relation to Leviticus and Numbers about the importance of analogical thought in the ancient world and in primal societies. In this symmetrical structure, Genesis 34 stands 17 chapters in from the end of the book. What stands in the analogical spot, 17 chapters in from the beginning of the book, is the second account of God's covenant with Abraham, the version that is known as the covenant of circumcision. In Genesis itself, there is only one other passing reference to circumcision, following immediately on the birth of Isaac. But in Genesis 17 and Genesis 34, circumcision is thematically central to the narrative. The covenant of circumcision in Genesis 17 follows immediately on the account of Abraham receiving a new name. It is a mark of the most intimate relationship and community with God, a mark of an eternal relationship, a mark of the promise of fruitfulness in all its forms. Historically and communally, circumcision is the marker of inclusion and incorporation within the community. It is the mark of promise, of grace, and of blessing. In Genesis 17, it is a mark of inclusion not only for the yet-to-be-born Isaac, but for Ishmael, the son of the slave woman. It is therefore not to be construed as something inward-looking, but an advanced sign, a proleptic marker of the day when all human beings will be drawn into intimate relationship, transparency, and blessing in the life and promise of God. It's not simply that Genesis 4 stands structurally in a relationship of analogy to Genesis 17. The two chapters are brought into thematic relationship by the repetition of the term circumcision, 11 times in chapter 17 and 5 times in chapter 34. What does circumcision become in chapter 34? It becomes a mechanism for deceit rather than honest dealing. Instead of invitation into a wider community of intimate relationship, transparency, and blessing, it becomes the mechanism for genocide, for the enforcement of social codes, for the closing down of potential relationships of fruitfulness. And what makes this stand out is the presence of the egregious violence in Genesis 34. If it had been a narrative about a social contract negotiated with the Shechemites, which the family of Jacob then welched on and moved away, it would be a typical Jacob story of nasty double dealing. But it takes the sign of God's most intimate entering into human relationship with the human family and transforms that through an excessive violence into betrayal and genocide. It is a form of anti-covenant. We want to imagine that this story can be located in some primitive, savage world of the early 2nd millennium BCE. To read it from under the table in its redactional relationship with Genesis 17 requires us to read it very differently. But this is also our story. This is the story of European Canadian Christians who came to a foreign place, entered into peaceful relationship with the inhabitants, settled down among them, and invited them into the sign and covenant of baptism, the most intimate marker we knew, signifying mutual community and relationship with God. Then we set about murdering them, militarily, economically, culturally, socially. We seized their children. We abused them in horrific ways. We occluded their women from traditional patterns of social agency and power. We enforced our social structures and values on them with inspectors, police, and armies. We promised them grace, and we gave them genocide. In its own complexities and ambiguities, in its silences and omissions, however, Genesis 34 also reminds us that even the shadow side of our own history is not transparent to interpretation, that the chasm between intention and action may be wider than we can leap. And as Jacob's final speech comments in its comparatively rare turn of phrase, we too may have to live with the reality of our own stench among the inhabitants of the land.